Brings me to the third category of consequence, and to me, perhaps one that is very unremarked upon yet, which is the incredible damage done to the strict scrutiny standard by the California Supreme Court's improvident action. I applaud again the court's honesty in recognizing that what they did was a case of first impression, that there were indeed no precedents in the court upon which to rely, and only one in the entire recorded history of American law. And that was itself a reach. The Massachusetts case, because Massachusetts did not go to strict scrutiny. So it was a pivotal, enormous break with everything that had been written before, and I listened with interest to David's attempt to make it other than that. It seems to me good argument, but bad analysis to say that this was simply another step along a road long traveled and well traveled. It was an enormous leap up of a very high cliff when it comes to strict scrutiny. Page 99. Our decisions make clear that the most important factors in deciding whether characteristics should be considered a constitutionally suspect basis for classification are whether the class of persons who exhibit a certain characteristic historically have been subject to invidious and prejudicial treatment, and whether society now recognizes that the characteristic in question generally bears no relationship to the individual's ability to perform or contribute to society. If you take this debate completely out of the issue of sexual orientation, and you ask where strict scrutiny has gone now, how it has metastasized, you have to ask yourself not just about the proverbial red-headed stepchild, whom we always referred to as being invidiously discriminated against in the course of literature, etc., but at other categories that can make equally valid claims to those two characteristics. That is, that they have been historically subject to invidious and prejudicial treatment, and that characteristic in question generally bears no relationship to the individual's ability to perform or contribute to society. Without working very long, of course we come first to the disabled. Differently abled are a community with which I'm very familiar. I work on Prop 10 for 10 years here in California, and they are legion in the state, and they have been invidiously discriminated against in many forms for many decades. Is strict scrutiny going to be applied to them? For those of you who are lawyers, I refer you to Claiborne case by the Supreme Court. There's a reason the Supreme Court does not want to raise that classification as strict scrutiny, for it will destroy the precision and the legislative balancing that must go into the decisions dealing with the differently abled. That has now been blown up if the California Supreme Court is going to follow its own rules. There are other categories, of course. The obese. Those who are morbidly obese can easily point to, and have for years, to the invidious discrimination that they suffer, and to the fact that much of that discrimination has nothing to do with their characteristic. In addition to that, one might argue as well that illegal immigrants are now subject to strict scrutiny under the California standard because they have been invidiously discriminated against for many decades in California in the worst sorts of forms, and that can be shown in many characteristics to have nothing to do with their status. Finally, if you reach really hard and you push very hard, will felons be the next to say, under the California's new standard of strict scrutiny, we are invidiously discriminated against, and having paid our price, having completely conformed to the law's requirement that we pay our penalty, why are we now being disqualified under other categories? This has very little to do with sexual orientation and the political debate, which is completely distinct from what has happened legally in the California law. But the explosion that had to be set off to detonate the barrier to same-sex marriage, which is the previous Proposition 22, has taken a lot of collateral damage with it to the legal system in California, which we only dimly understand at this point and which will travel. Two more categories of consequence. Consequences to the reputation of the court. It is devastating. The pure willfulness of this decision, best summed up in Justice Baxter's dissent as legal jujitsu, is going to be a long time in the repair. It is far worse than that which followed in Bush v. Gore because it is far more sudden, and it overturned a standing decision by the people of California less than a decade over. It is very damaging long-term to the idea of a fair but appropriately limited court understanding of its reach within a balanced system. This week I have been teaching U.S. v. Nixon, the tapes case, and I spend a lot of time saying how it was at that moment of constitutional crisis that a 9-0 decision of the court forced this president, whom I served, by the way, to hand over the tapes without a whimper, because the authority of the court was so far above that of any other political branch. It's an authority that was exercised in Brown v. Board, and it's an authority best exercised in unanimity over areas about which there has been fundamental political work done to achieve the sort of consensus from which that kind of authority can flow. What the California Supreme Court has done is simply mark themselves as a very activist court in pursuit of a very distinct and not yet majoritarian position, though it might someday become one. Finally, the damage to the very idea of constitutional majoritarianism is to me the most profound. The majority, as David detailed, in this state has been working over a long period of time to achieve a legislatively determined balance with regards how to deal with same-sex couples. It might well have eventually gone to the ballot to repeal Prop 22, and had it done so, it would have done so in the context of the sort of organic political development by which Western civilization has advanced best. Gradual, incremental, from the middle. Instead, by overturning Proposition 22 and by issuing what amounts to a judicial diktat, it disinherited the voters who had participated many years before in a very vigorous and vocal concern, and it threw the court and the opponents of traditional marriage into a very fraudulent and costly fray about what is going on the ballot today, one that I think deeply damages the very cause for which same-sex marriage advocates have so long labored, which is the acceptance, because it is right, of that which they so profoundly believe, which is the right of same-sex couples to marry. Proposition 8, as a result, and I will close where David does with a couple of arguments about the proposition itself, is necessary, and it has nothing to do with the underlying issue. It has everything to do with issuing a vitally necessary rebuke to an arrogant, elitist court seeking to impose the social preferences of 4 of 7 justices upon a state of 30 millions. It should be reversed, even if in the very next cycle, a constitutional amendment bestowing same-sex rights of marriage were to pass overwhelmingly. This is not so much about same-sex marriage. It is about how we are to be governed as a free people, and in this instance, it ought not to be by a majority, to quote Justice Scalia, of an unelected court. Thanks.
Okay, next up, another member of the Chapman faculty, been here not quite since the beginning, but close, since 1999, Professor Catherine Darmer.